Welcome to Cal Talks. This is Marcelo Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida. And this is our podcast, where we dive into the main topics affecting livestock and forage production in the southeastern United States. Join us in this journey as we tackle the main issues affecting our producers and the sustainability of our production systems. Hello, and welcome to Cal Talks. This is Marcelo Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist and Associate Program Leader with the University of Florida. Today, we have two recurring guests, Dr. Cheryl Mackowiak from the North Florida Research and Education Center in Quincy, our soil scientist, and David Zierden, our state climatologist. Welcome.
Good morning.
Thank you, Marcelo. It's great to be here.
Thank you, guys. So to start with, we are getting towards the end of our winter, our cool season, getting toward the spring as we released this podcast today. And we've seen a very unusual year, at least for me. I've been in Florida for 8 years. That's the first time I've seen the magnitude of the drought and also the cold injury on our forages and many other crops that we had this year. David, I would like to explore with you a little bit more of what is going on. We recorded back in the fall as we were preparing for planting season. We record forecast, and you said it's going to be a La Niña year. We're going to expect drier than normal, warmer than normal. And here we go. We have one of the record sustained cold weathers in terms of lowest temperature and also in sustained cold. What is happening?
Okay, well, let's first talk about the drought side of it. What happened is we had a close to average hurricane season in the Atlantic Basin, a little less than was forecast by NOAA and Colorado State. But the main thing is we had no Gulf storms or hurricanes and no landfalls along the northern Gulf Coast. So no one wants a hurricane. Tropical moisture is a critical part of our precipitation climate. And we missed out on that this year. And the second part of that is we've seen it over and over again. When a major or a strong hurricane takes the path up the Atlantic off the East Coast, like Hurricane Erin and Hurricane Melissa did this year, it leaves us here in Florida on the western periphery, which has subsidence or sinking air, drier air, amplified high pressure. It really shuts off the rainfall. And so with the preferred hurricane tracks this year, it was really the initial trigger to the onset of dryness and drought. And then you also mentioned we are in the La Niña phase in the Pacific Ocean, which is colder than normal water along the equator. And La Niña is well known to bring a drier and usually warmer winter to the southeast in the state of Florida. And we definitely saw the drier side of it this year, not so much the colder side. So that kind of explains our drought. Right now in the state of Florida, we're in the worst drought of 25 years. More area, 67% of the state is now designated as D3 or extreme drought. And I imagine Cheryl can talk more about what that means to the range and pasture assistance program, disaster assistance from USDA. So we really are D3 or extreme drought corresponds to a 1 in 25 year event. And with all the indicators, we're kind of right on schedule with that.
That is very interesting. So the deal is what our farmers are experiencing in the field is not just the dry and cold winter. We had an unusually drier summer, fall, and now winter, which led to this historic drought. And then we come to the cold weather. So what happened this year? We had very early cold snaps. And from what I was looking into our data to try to make sense of our experiments in the field, why they are suffering so much, we had some first frosts in early November, which is kind of early for, at least for what we had experienced in the past several years. And then in December, despite having some cold weather, it warmed up a lot. We had some very warm stretch there that pushed a lot of our forage, especially under irrigation, to advance faster than expected in terms of maturity. Then Christmas came in first week of January, and then things went very chilly. And it sustained cold weather for several weeks in the beginning of January. And then we continue to have those occurrences of lower temperatures, which is normal. Cold front comes, drop temperature, we have a frost or a few days of cold weather, then goes up again, like we're experiencing now as we record here. Probably another cold front coming and dropping temperatures this weekend. So, help me understand what happened here. First of all, this unusually cold, or is it as unusual? And then the sustained cold weather, the length of time that we had cold days.
Yeah, no, it's been exceptional this year. Kind of without going too deep into the weeds, we can talk about the polar vortex and the Arctic oscillation. Real simply, the polar vortex is not a single storm that comes down and impacts for a few days. The polar vortex is a semi permanent feature high in the atmosphere, 30 miles up over the North Pole and the Arctic. And when this polar vortex is well behaved, tight, and strong, it tends to keep the polar jet stream well behaved and the colder air to our north. Periodically, some winters it's more prevalent than others. This polar vortex will weaken or even break down. And when that happens, it kind of has a cascading effect down through the atmosphere, leads to a polar jet stream, which really drives our weather that is much more amplified, unstable, wavier, if you will, than normal, which allows these intrusions of Arctic air into the deep south. And we saw an extended period of this disrupted polar vortex in late December and January. And also, along with that, the Arctic oscillation is more a measure of sea level pressure patterns in the northern hemisphere. And when that goes negative, and it was highly negative for a 3 or 4 week period, that often leads to winter weather, extreme cold here in the eastern United States and the southeast. With both of those, we saw an extended unstable period, and that's what led to these long periods of cold weather or repeated cold weather here in Florida and the tri-state area. By a lot of measures, it's kind of the most prolonged cold since the winter of 2010, which I think we all remember. Some facts and figures here in Tallahassee, we've had 21 days where the temperature reached 30 degrees or below. We had temperatures in the teens in one of these systems as far south as Ocala. Low temperatures less than 30 degrees all the way down to West Palm Beach. And it was periods of extended cold too. In Gainesville, Florida, there was a period of 9 days in a row with freezing temperatures overnight. So it wasn't just one cold event, it was the sustained and prolonged cold that also did a lot of damage.
Do you have any numbers of the impact that this cold weather had in general in Florida crops? Because it was all the way down to the south of the peninsula.
No, I don't have any real numbers other than what I've read in conventional media. I've seen a number of stories on the damage to horticulture and trees, plants, nursery business sustained a lot of damage. Another side effect is, as you've seen with the forage and pastures, but also just lots of low ground cover will be killed back by these freezing temperatures. And so that's going to provide a lot of dry and flammable fuel for the wildfire season. And that's going to be a concern going forward. We've got the combination of the freeze damage and the severe drought that's going on. So wildfire is a big concern. Over 30 counties are currently enacting burn bans. So that's a big concern going forward.
That's a very, very good consideration. Let's shift a little bit to the Forge world, Cheryl. We've been working together. I've been very frustrated this year, but also has been a year for learning for us. Of course, it's easy to say we're learning. It's great for us to learn, but when this is affecting so many of our farmers and it's really hurting on the pocket, that is not a thing to take lightly. What have you seen in the fields this year? We've been working at the dairies. Those are irrigated systems and high nutrient. But also, if you want to make some comments about the regular pasture over seeded pastures and those that are not irrigated.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to work in both places because the dairy is really pushing the forages to go fast and hard. So when you have exceptionally warm days, like we're close to breaking hot temperature records, right? And then we're going to go back to maybe sub 30 for a day or two. Plants are not hardening off, as you well know. And so that makes them exceptionally sensitive to this kind of damage. So when we think of dairies, we're putting a lot of water, a lot of nutrients out, and so they're growing fast, and that makes them more susceptible at certain times when they're jointing, especially when the stems are really starting to elongate after the tillering stage. But in typical pastures, the water's not nearly as much, especially during the drought, and fertility's a little on the low side, so they're a little bit stunted and slowed down. A lot of times they're putting that seed out a little bit later than some of the dairies, and we know that the later plantings seem to be a little more tolerant to when some of those cold snaps happen. And the wheat, oats, and some of the triticales seem to be most affected. Ryegrass, I've seen some minor damage, but I haven't seen much at all in terms of cold damage with ryegrass. So that's one of the good things, but ryegrass doesn't like drought. So if you don't have water, it's probably sitting there because it has no water to help it grow.
So I think you touched one of the important points, Cheryl, is that that maturity when we are in a physiological stage where cold weather hits. Here I have three different crops and phases of development here, and you can see the oats in the side here. They are very, very twisted. Oats are normally known for low cold tolerance. Ryegrass in the middle here. And yes, ryegrass didn't suffer as much, but you can see this leaf here that's all twisted. That's a sign of stress. And you see some of the tip burn. But tip burn's fine. We're protecting the meristem. The problem is when you start getting into the reproductive phase, that those meristems that the growing point gets exposed. And we have the cold weather. This figure on the right here, it's an empty seed head. Some people call blank or ghost seed head, but basically the flower, the embryo got killed because of the frost. And what happens is growing point that is below ground early in the season in the vegetative phase grows above ground. Below ground temperatures are more stable and normally don't freeze here in Florida, and then above ground is going to freeze, and those plant parts get frozen, and that means they just die. We did see a lot of differences in variety too, not only on the species. So here in this picture was before one of the big cold fronts that came. So this is triticale, and you can see the three different varieties here that we're testing in our variety trials. Some of them, like this T2 here, triticale number 2 in our trial, had suffered a lot more. Same thing we saw with rye, but you can see on the left the same blank seed heads on the rye. In the Florida 405, which is an extremely fast growing rye, took a lot more damage than something like Ella Grazer, which is later maturity. And the important thing here to understand is we selected a lot of those forages because we want early maturity. We want them to grow fast. We want to graze earlier. We want to cut them for silage by late February before there is need to plant corn. But because they're early maturity, because they got off the ground, they got into this reproductive stage early, they were more affected by the frost. Anything that was late maturing forages, including the ryegrasses, were protected, so they were not as affected this year. And yes, we see some pretty bad devastation in some of the dairies that there was really not much what else to do but cut.
You're talking about the dairy fields that did a combination of triticale oats, which were our two most sensitive varieties. If they did ryegrass, they came out all right.
On the other side of that, I've seen is a lot of people, it was very dry. So many people just could not get the forages planted in time. So they waited until December to plant, or mid-December. In my farm, actually, we planted late December. And yeah, we got some germination, but they just stayed there. We didn't lose it because they were still in a phase that they were able to harden. I planted probably after that hot December part, was towards late part of December. So the plants harden, but they just have not moved forward in a month and a half.
I'm seeing out in this area, we're west of Tallahassee, and those that planted early December, Thanksgiving, where a lot of people plant right around Thanksgiving or so, they look all right. Because the other thing, when they're getting frosted on top, they can graze that off pretty easily. So again, they are slower. So it'll be interesting to see as we hit these 80 plus days repeatedly, if they're just going to fall apart more quickly.
If we have waters in our farms since the beginning of December, I think we had less than 3 inches of rain, or just over 3 inches.
Yeah, it's interesting because at my place, and yeah, I can see the surface soil is damp, and it stays pretty damp because every week we'll get maybe a third of an inch, half an inch, just enough, but we're not creating any reservoir of moisture, right? It's just, it's keeping the very surface. So if we do have a period, a run of 3 or 4 dry days, that will be taken up pretty quick. So we're not replacing or replenishing anything by any means.
So, Cheryl, tell us something about the fertility. How does fertility management influences on those stresses that we saw this year?
Well, one thing that people all are pretty knowledgeable about nitrogen, and if they have the money and they know they need the nitrogen, they'll put it out. This is one situation where if you put out too much nitrogen, you can have more sensitive growth, just like disease sensitivity. Too much nitrogen is not good. A little bit lower nitrogen's better. The other thing with high nitrogen is you could end up with these cold spells. Depending on when you put that nitrogen out, the plants are stunted, but the nitrogen's still there. And when they can take it up, now you've got much more nitrogen in a smaller package, which means you have an accumulation of nitrates. And that's not a good thing. Some of the concentrations, that's one thing we have some concern with. And the same with drought. So depending on the timing of your nitrogen and your turnout dry and didn't give the plants time to grow and take that up, you probably want to get that forage tested so you're not running into nitrate issues. The other thing is potassium. That's probably the one nutrient that we're most often deficient in. And potassium's kind of like people are used to Gatorades and all these electrolytes. It's kind of the electrolyte for plants. It really helps modify dry conditions. It can handle those drier conditions and colder conditions as well. So if you have good potassium fertility, it's not going to cure all your problems, but if that is good, you'll tend to be a little more tolerant of some of these episodes.
Perfect. The other thing I want to add to that is we saw some effect of grazing management too, because everybody that was desperate for forage and ended up grazing too early, they really sacrificed their pastures because you were exposing those growing points. You're just reducing that photosynthetic capacity of that plant, and you end up at the end with less forage. The idea of harvesting more to be more efficient is actually the opposite. You end up losing efficiency and losing total productivity because you're trying to harvest more. Those are important, very important points. And I hope to share some of this and more in some of the articles we wrote that are going to come, especially with the results from this year's variety trials that we're going to post on our social media and also through our traditional venues like the Cattleman's Journal and the Panhandle Ag News to explore some of those effects. Now, David, uncertainty, everything is uncertainty. Can you fix everything for us? Farming is what we say is an open factory. I mean, there is so many things we don't control. Temperatures we don't control. Water we may be able to control if there is irrigation, but that's not the only answer. As we saw this year, even irrigated systems had major impact. Moving forward, what is your feeling about? What is your thought about those types of uncertainties? Do we need to be thinking more about strategies to combat or at least mitigate those extreme weather events that we're seeing seemingly more frequent over and over again now?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not a farmer. I just work with agriculture. I have for decades, but there's so much I don't know. I know one strategy that's been very successful is for row crops is the use of cover crops, and especially high residue cover crops like rye and such. It helps really hold the rainfall and let it infiltrate into the soil instead of losing it to runoff. This past squall line that we had Sunday was fast moving, had intense rain rates, but it was over in just an hour or so. And on this dry soil, much of it was lost to runoff rather than infiltrating and being available later. So the use of row crops makes the whole system more resilient to these kind of extreme rainfall events and periods of dryness. So that's one thing I've learned in my years. Other than that, kind of pay attention to the seasonal forecast, the El Nino, La Nina cycle. I've talked with a farmer in, I believe, Madison County, Mac Finlayson, cattle farmer, and he anticipated this dryness. We talked together in the fall, and he really lined up suppliers and contracts for cut hay so that he could sustain the herd through this dry winter. Things like that, kind of plan ahead, especially pay attention to these long-term forecasts. There's a lot we cannot forecast, and there's, like you say, there's a lot of uncertainty. So the more adaptable and nimble your operation is, of course, the better.
I love your line of thought here, because many times we just say, "Well, there is nothing I could have done," but what you could have done, if you can plan ahead, if you can work with those models and see, okay, this might be a problem. What are the strategies? So you have an action plan. At least it can help at minimum mitigate and save you money. This year is the first year that my neighbor said that the first year in more than 20 years had to buy hay, and that happened. It's probably happening a lot with our farmers, and I see a lot of hay being transported on the highways because we went from a dry summer where they were not able to get all the hay that they normally do into a dry fall and winter where they did not have the cool season forages. So it's an accumulation of challenges here that we need to find ways to mitigate. Cheryl, from your perspective, what are the strategies that you'd like to see for us to improve the resilience of our systems and hedge a little bit against those challenges?
Well, you and I have both been talking to some of the dairy producers, and some of them are going to maybe shift towards more cold tolerant varieties. But again, it's a moving target. So next year, everything could be perfect, and they'll be like, "Oh, why did I change over to ryegrass, which is a later variety or plant? I wish I was growing oats right now." So that's their livelihood. So all we can do is make some recommendations and then hope, leave it to them to decide what they want to do. But that gives us a large variety of choices too, right? And sometimes maybe we have too many choices for folks, and it gets a little confusing. But for the average pastures, those types of things, number one, get the right varieties for your region. Be careful of buying things that are cheap if they're not something that we already recommend for this area. And make sure it's certified seed, it's new seed, not 2-year-old seed, that type of thing. So you get a good start regardless of what conditions we have. If you're high and dry most years, ryegrass might not be a good option. So, that one really needs more water than some of these other small grains. If you tend to be on the dry side, cereal rye and triticale are good options as well. So talk with your county extension agent. If they don't have the answers, they can come back and talk to you, Marcelo, myself, and there's a few others in the group as well. I think that's the best thing, but figure out what you want to do. Have some conversations maybe with your extension agent and plan well ahead of time. I think, David, there's updates that all through the year of where things are heading, at least a couple, 2 to 3 months in advance. And so knowing that, say by July or so, might give you a good idea of where you might be going. Because if we do go into an El Nino, that tends to be cooler, not cold, but cooler moisture conditions. It could be ideal for a mix of legumes and oats, and those types of things are perfect growing conditions for some of our best forages. So don't get too worried about what happened this year and say that's where we are for the next 3 years.
Yeah.
Let's take a deep breath and then plan ahead of time would be good.
Yeah, and I think a lot of our farmers, especially on the dairy side, because there's so much involved there, it's so high investment and the need for the forage, and they are depending on that. There is a tendency like, this happened this year, next year I'm going to change the whole system. But the deal is next year could be completely different. And I like the direction you're going, Cheryl, in terms of diversity. I mean, if I can have different options, if I can play with different forage options or forage mixers or fertilization strategies or planting times, that I can spread some of that risk, I think we would be much better off. You mentioned being ready for a good start or giving the forages a chance, and I think that's with any crop. As soon as we can get the crops off of the ground, get them growing, that gives an edge. And we've seen some of our trials where the fertilization or irrigation was limited, and the same variety, there's a stark difference in survival to the cold weather and also in disease incidence. You mentioned that excessive nitrogen can make the plants more susceptible, but also the lack of fertility can make them just sit there and not grow and be exposed to some of those diseases. We saw barley yellow dwarf virus this year too, affecting those small grains, especially oat.
The other thing is we know that if you do see some disease and we don't have much, if anything, to spray, especially for regular pastures, livestock, grazing is a good option. But like you said, oh, well, it's not growing much because it's got some drought. And they put the animals on there anyways. They've just made things worse, right? Because now they've grazed it right into the ground, and the recovery, if at all, is going to be very, very slow.
Perfect, perfect. There is a situation that I think grazing is going to be useful is when we have some disease incidents and you graze to remove that disease leaf, or in this case, also forages that were still in vegetative stage, meaning they are still have growth potential to go. And we use grazing to remove some of that injured material because that material is going to decline in quality. There's nothing else to do with that. So we might go ahead and remove, but keeping in mind that if you remove all the plant tissue, if you graze it to the ground, you're going to be sacrificing even more.
Grazing the cold damaged leaves is actually a really good idea. Our retired forage breeder often recommends that, because one of the other reasons is because then it's another harbinger for diseases too. So you want to get that off the ground. So bad quality, potentially carry more disease. Get it out. If there's time, that's great. Also, Marcelo, right? We really want to graze it to ground if it's covering our perennial warm season grasses too. So that's the time we really promote grazing down to the ground, right?
That's the 2 times of the year that I tell people graze it to the ground is with cows, not with heifers, is when you need to either plant cool season forages or we need to clean them to give space to the warm season forage grasses to come. I had a question asked to me recently, Cheryl, and hope you can confirm my answer. But some folks were asking, so with this excessive cold weather and dry, what is going to happen to the warm season perennials? Did it kill the warm season perennials also? It's going to affect the regrowth in the spring.
Well, we could follow the soil temperatures. Even our coldest days, and I just do it by feel. I'm walking through my yard. We've had days, past years, where the ground was frozen at the surface. You could tell when you walk and it's hard, right? I have yet to have that happen. And so I think our rhizomes and that root systems in the ground have done pretty well. I'm not too concerned, unless you have something that's real tropical, that we don't promote necessarily anyways. I think we're all.
And the challenge with the tropical is that because they lack dormancy, they don't go dormant in the first cold, then the second cold kills them. But for most of our warm season perennial forages, they went pretty dormant, pretty dead dormant.
Yeah, they've been dormant because of the dry. And in fact, that, if anything, if you see damage and you see a poor recovery, it's probably not the cold, it's probably the dry weather that really did it in. And then we also, if people please take a look and scout around as things start greening up for take-all disease. And in this case, any diseases. If you start seeing dead patches in your Bahia grass, especially, and even Bermuda grass, don't wait around to see what's going to happen with it. You might talk to your extension agent and get a sample out to see, because it's easier to treat a small area than the whole field. So that's something that starts taking effect in the fall, but we don't notice it till the following spring.
Yeah, and often we're seeing a strong link between those diseases and just a lack of general pasture health, which is related to pasture nutrition and overgrazing. David, to wrap up here, what can you tell us about the spring? Are we in for a good spring? Do we have any forecasts for this coming spring and growing season?
Yes, the Climate Prediction Center still is hanging on to the traditional La Nina pattern, which means drier than normal for sure, and possibly warmer than normal as we go through the remainder of February into March, maybe even early April. After that, no matter what the Pacific Ocean is doing, we lose a lot of humidity. So as we get into late April and May and the summer growing season, not a lot of predictability. With all that in mind, we are in the middle of a historic drought. And as we get into late March and April, that is a very dry time of the year, just climatologically. So we can't count on a lot of water at that time going forward. What that means as we get later into the spring and early summer, we really can't tell. And there's one other thing I'd like to mention is there's a lot of concern for late season freezes, especially crops like watermelon and such like that. I have yet to identify anything that correlates to the occurrence or non-occurrence of a late season freeze, not the phase of the Pacific Ocean, not how cold the previous winter was. I've yet to find anything that correlates. It's more just a randomness of how the weather systems come together. Everyone's seen the probability tables of 50% probability of your last freeze, 90% probability. Pay attention to those, but there's really no indicator above climatology on when a late season freeze could occur.
Thank you so much for all the info you shared with us today. It's very, very rich information that help us put some of what happened in perspective and also plan for the next season and also for the next year. Cheryl, David, thank you so much for participating in the Cow Talks today. And I hope to have you back soon to discuss more of our production systems here.
Thanks. It was good seeing everyone.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd love to join you anytime.
Thank you. And for those listening, check also some of the articles that we published recently about the cold damage effect. And we also have some more information on pasture management in our Cow Talks podcast from last week's episode, if you want to learn more about fertilization and grazing management. As always, let us know how you like our episodes. If you have any feedback or ideas for us, reach out to us through our email, forages@ifas.ufl.edu, or through our social media channels. We'd love to hear from you. Always consult your local extension agent if you need more information, or reach out to us, as I said. Thank you so much, and see you in our next Cow Talks podcast. This podcast was brought to you by the University of Florida Forage team with technical support from the University of Florida, College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, Faculty Instructional Resource and Support Team. This episode was produced by Marcelo Wallau, Olivia Mowley, and Ashley Kanabrowski. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast.